And I'm delighted to introduce our featured speaker, and that is Dr. Rebecca Karam. Dr. Karam is a Dean's Research Associate in the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University. Her work examines how ethnic and racial minorities navigate their place in America's racial hierarchy, while accounting for the increasingly salient role of religious identity in these processes. Her dissertation project, entitled Making Muslim Americans, Parenting Practices, Parochial Schools, and the Transmission of Faith Across Generations in Metropolitan Detroit, was defended in 2020. This ethnographic and interview-based project examines the intergenerational transmission of religion and parenting strategies among second-generation Muslim American adults. Despite Islam being widely stigmatized in contemporary America, this project provides evidence of patterns of upper middle-class Muslim Americans assimilating socioeconomically without losing their religious identity. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Rebecca Karam. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much to the Muslim Studies program for hosting me and for all the sponsors. Thank you, Mohammed, for setting this up, and for everyone who is here in person and the folks who are Zooming in today. So I graduated from the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City, but I was born and raised in Metro Detroit. It's where my research is, and that's what I'll be talking about today, is about the Muslim American community in suburban Detroit. Now, I want to begin with just a little story which helps explain my entree into this research, and also gives sort of a glimpse into the findings I'm going to present today. So in 2016, I was working for a local think tank, and I was tasked with measuring Muslim contributions to the state of Michigan. And while I was doing that, I went to like a lot of events, and one was a charity event for Syrian refugees. And so I walk into this banquet hall, and there's hundreds of movers and shakers in Michigan's Muslim community. And I'm a little overwhelmed, but I'm here to not only support the Syrian American community that's, at the time we were accepting over 5,000 refugees in 2016, but I was there also to meet some new folks for this study. And so I am sitting down at a table with about a dozen Muslim mothers, and they're all discussing school choices for their kids. Now, I know from past encounters with these women that they live in some of the best public school districts in Michigan. I also know that they have the financial resources to send their kids to some of the best preparatory academies in the entire country. But while they were having this discussion, they weren't just talking about the public schools and those private schools, they were also talking about small Islamic schools and other religious organizations, small in-home co-op networks. And I was kind of taken aback by this, because in the sociological literature, what many social scientists focus on is how minority groups pass on upward mobility to their children. But what these parents were discussing is a school choice that sort of runs counter to strictly upward mobility, because if you were really concerned with getting your kids into Ivy League schools, you probably wouldn't want to enroll them in a small religious academy. But that's exactly what these parents were doing. They were picking and choosing amongst all of their children, trying to maximize both Islamic education for their kids, and as well as getting them ready to join the ranks of some of the best colleges around the country. So that's really how this project got started, as I was interested in this unique parenting decision. Now, as we know, this decision is complicated, of course, because Islam is one of the most stigmatized religions in the United States. While it is the fastest growing, or among the fastest growing religions in the country, a very small minority of Muslim Americans polled believe that being Muslim has gotten easier in recent decades. And in fact, the Pew data tells us that anti-Muslim assaults have actually exceeded post 9/11 levels, which tells us that right now, or in this current period, Islam is even more stigmatized than it was immediately following 9/11. So how and why would American-born Muslims want to pass on this potentially stigmatizing faith onto their kids? And what does it say about their incorporation into mainstream society? So the empirical, or the way that I frame this study is by looking at Annette Leroux's important research on parenting strategies. So she argued that the United States was bifurcated by class, and that this sort of pattern is reified by divergent parenting strategies. So, for example, upper middle class parents, she said, were known for raising their kids with what she called concerted cultivation techniques. So she was borrowing from, she was using gardening as a sort of metaphor for parenting. So while some parents would sort of really try and play with the soil, make sure that the plant is getting the perfect amount of water and sunlight, there was another type of parenting, natural growth, where you might just put the pot on the windowsill, leave it alone, say, well, if the plant is meant to survive and thrive, it will, and if not, hey, what can you do? And so basically lower and working class families were raised with this more naturalistic type of parenting strategy, whereas upper middle class parents were able to reproduce class status using this concerted cultivation technique. So instead of water and soil levels, parents might enroll their kids in after school activities. If they're starting to slide in math, going to put them in Kumon. Doesn't matter how much money or time it will cost. We're going to spare no expense to make sure that this child is thriving, and it will ultimately reproduce or even exceed the class level that they were raised in. But my question is, how does religion fit into this? Now, as I already indicated, in most sociological literature, minority identities are assumed to be something that holds people back, and that maybe they by clinging to that minority identity, it might be a sign of an oppositional identity, something that sort of shows that they're not integrating into mainstream society. However, what I've found among this group of parents is that they were weaving religion into these concerted cultivation techniques. And I'll get to more of the findings in just a moment. But in terms of my data and methods, I conducted over 2 years of ethnographic research during the 2016 through 2018 academic school years in suburban Metro Detroit. I conducted in-depth interviews with 72 Muslim Americans, about half were South Asian and half were Arab American. And the majority were parents themselves who enrolled their children in one of 3 local full-time Islamic schools in Metro Detroit. Another 15 interviews were conducted with community leaders such as school teachers, school board members, and other after-school activity leaders, other people in the community. But really, my participant observation was to investigate parents' role in choosing the Muslim private schools in this context of these highly resourced suburban communities in Metro Detroit. Okay, so the first finding is how and why parents planted seeds for success and focusing on what success means to them. So this probably will not come as a surprise, because most parents in the United States envision success as sort of a socioeconomic achievement. We don't want their kids to struggle. They want their kids to go to college, have good careers. Most of these parents themselves, actually all of the parents except for one graduated from college in this sample, and the vast majority attended postgraduate school. Many held careers as lawyers, engineers, doctors, financiers, and other professional careers, and they wanted that for their children. They wanted their kids to reproduce that class standing. And so, yes, certainly these parents, like most parents, framed success in terms of socioeconomic achievement. However, what I also learned is that parents, while they wanted their kids to achieve these sort of socioeconomic benchmarks, reproduce class, they rejected tiger mom parenting and elitism. So a common sort of phrase among this group, or a worry, was that if you push the kids too hard, this might be really bad for their psychological development. That we want them to go to a good college, but maybe they don't need to go to Harvard or a UC, because if you do that, then their lives will be out of balance. They'll be focused so hard on their studies that they won't develop a strong sense of their own self. So they rejected this kind of elitism. But at the same time, they were very sure to guard against precariousness in the third generation. So they're trying to walk this sort of balance of, okay, we want our kids to have money and be successful and be able to, you know, continue to live in these same communities that we're raising them in, but we don't want them to go so far in the other direction where now they're sort of unstable or, you know, psychologically burdened by this sort of preference for elitism. Parents, however, also did something unique where they framed success in terms of what I term moral achievement. So parents often focused on not only should the children be making, you know, money as a professional, but anything they do, they should do with excellence. They were very concerned with reproducing the Muslim identity in the third generation. However, not any Muslim identity would do. They don't want their kids to be Muslim in name only, but then behave in a way that they feel doesn't comport with the Islamic identity. They want their kids to also maintain sort of stringent character traits. So they want to raise their kids with humility, empathy, you know, a hardworking sort of disposition that cares about the community. A lot of parents would say things like, I really want to make sure that my kids give a hoot about the people around them, the environment, that they're taking care of other people. So they really cautioned against, you know, Friday Muslims or people who just attended Jummah prayers, but also they wanted to make sure that every day they were living their best Muslim life. So this is kind of a tall order because they want their kids to meet these very, you know, particular socioeconomic benchmarks and these very particular religious or moral benchmarks for success. So here's another parent. As a parent, what do I want for my kids? I want them to be good citizens of this country, of society, to be able to contribute economically, but in a positive way. I want them to do it all with God in mind, to always remember that they're servants of God, to use God's morals that we find in the books like the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran, for those always to be a guide for them. If we look at some of the other sociological literature, particularly on Asian Americans, there's a heavy focus on trying to make sure that kids are really attaining these high levels of socioeconomic success. But what some sociologists have found is that it's not enough for parents to just sort of define success in this particular way. They have to uphold them. They have to create support mechanisms in order for this to come into existence. In other words, you can't just wish these things into existence. You have to really help your kids thrive. And so I found that the sort of tangible resources that parents were using to support this definition of success was school selection and mosque services. So as I said in the beginning, parents were really struggling about, you know, what schools among, you know, in this vast array of schooling options that are open to them, what should we choose? And as you might be able to tell, these parents are very highly educated themselves and they have the resources to pick. You know, they're not like working class or underclass folks who turn to religious schools in order to avoid poorly performing public schools. This is somebody, they pay taxes in some of the best school districts in the country and they can send their kids there. So, you know, it doesn't exactly make sense that they would be, you know, really taking so much time to focus on school, but here we are. And so they're focusing not only on the Islamic schools, but also trying to make sure that their kids are meeting rigorous sort of standards in terms of standardized testing, which means that even though they're paying $5,000 to $8,000 per pupil to send their children to Islamic schools, they're spending a lot of money outside of school to make sure that their kids are in Kumon or math tutoring, that they're hitting all their reading benchmarks. And so these are some of the sort of tangible resources. In addition, the mosques that they belong to, many of them are run by American-born Muslims as well. And that means that the sort of programming at these masjids are sort of aimed at parents in their exact situation. Of course, you want a sort of religious institution to meet the needs of the congregants. So there would be mosque services that were geared not only at trying to develop the Muslim identity that they wanted for their kids, but maybe they would also be offering SAT prep courses, or there would be like a lecture from a local engineer telling them about their careers. And this is how I got into this job, and here's how you might get there as well. Things like talks about college scholarships. So this sort of shows the ways that the two institutions, both schools and mosques, were working sort of hand in hand to reinforce both definitions of success, the socioeconomic markers and the moral markers of success, in a way that might be surprising to some other folks who might think of religious institutions as serving only religious needs and school institutions as really only propping up socioeconomic markers. We're seeing this sort of blending of both. Now, the other form, or another way to sort of cultivate success or promote success in the third generation, is this really tight organization of the daily life. So what Annette Leroux found in her study on the bifurcation of America based on class status and the parenting techniques is that among upper middle class parents, they would be micromanaging every moment of their child's life. Every moment was scheduled, making sure that not only are they, in school from 9, until 3, but then after school, they're shuttling from soccer practice, piano lessons, and then if they have a doctor's appointment, they're training their kids how to speak, and they're preparing them for the adult world to be able to look their physician in the eye, let's say, and have a one-on-one conversation, even from a young age. And this is really different from working class parents. Now, what I found in this community is that they were doing all of those sort of typical upper middle class parenting techniques to raise them to be socioeconomically successful, but they were also using those same techniques to teach their children how to be proud of their Muslim identity, to hold on to those moral markers of success. So, for example, part of my ethnographic research was that I attended Boy Scout meetings at one of the Muslim schools over the course of several months. And one day we went to a firehouse where the boys were going to learn, first aid techniques from the firefighters in the Troy firehouse. And at the start of every Boy Scout meeting, the Boy Scout leader would start the meeting praying Al-Fatiha. And most of the Boy Scout meetings that I had gone to up until this point had been in more private spaces, like at the school or in the woods. But this was the first time I saw them in public. And so the Boy Scout leader led them in prayer right outside the public firehouse, where many other Boy Scout troops were walking in past them. And what was happening was some of the other parents who were, typical white American Anglo-Saxon Protestant, probably children and parents, they were walking in kind of looking at these, this group of fathers and sons praying in Arabic and kind of like, what's going on here? Some were sort of confused, some were really squinting, but they carried on, and the parents continued to pray with their children. And what I took from this is that the parents are teaching their children that it doesn't matter where you are in the United States, we still want you to pray like we always pray. You use your voice loud and you stand up straight and tall. And then we go inside and we learn first aid techniques that can be used to help members of our community and the broader community as well. And so it's these types of experiences where we're seeing that even small minor moments in terms of the organization of daily life, parents are blending both and trying to teach their kids to meet both the socioeconomic and the moral markers of success. At the same time, other sort of activities that were not typically seen as Muslim. So for example, like some parents had their kids enrolled in yoga and taekwondo, typical American after-school activities. Parents reinterpreted those as being, as helping to uphold the Muslim sort of interpretation that they held. So for example, a lot of parents talked about how respecting one's body, learning to be strong, keeping your body healthy, that those were all sort of God-willed activities. And so they sort of reconfigure taekwondo not just as sort of activity that might teach them discipline or help them make friends, but also reinterpreting them in sort of a Muslim frame. So we can see how all of these little things are working together to uphold and are intended to support both ideas of success, being socioeconomic markers and these moral markers of success. Okay. So really what I want to take away from this study is that in sociology and across the social sciences, we come to understand success in sort of this very objective way, where we measure it based on where did you purchase your home? Are you a homeowner? What is your annual income? What's your household income? What's the level of educational attainment? What about your linguistic attainment? We have these sort of very objective measures of success, but when you go in and study a community on their own terms, what we find is that communities members themselves have their own subjective ideas of success that may or may not comport to what social scientists sort of expect. And so this choice to send their children to Islamic parochial schools, as a social scientist, we might be trained to look at that with a sort of inquisitive eye and think, well, okay, well, maybe that is not actually helping to support this objectively defined, idea of success that we hold. However, when you are able to conduct these ethnographic studies, it allows us to sort of transcend these normative assumptions about integration or assimilation or what success means to a community. What we also find is that concerted cultivation techniques, which we are known to help reproduce class status across generation, can also be used for the intergenerational transmission of religion. This has not yet been studied, and I believe that future research could investigate these exact same techniques among many other religious communities. Some caveats about this study are, of course, that this takes place in Metro Detroit, which is home to one of the most highly concentrated Muslim American populations across the country. So it may be possible that some of the things that I'm seeing here are peculiar to Michigan. It's also, this is a very class-based study. We don't know if these sort of parenting techniques apply to people who are lesser resourced. It may be that parents in the working class enclaves of Hamtramck and Dearborn, they may be relying more on sort of the natural growth technique to pass on religion. It might be that they're relying on the local mosque to kind of do the heavy lifting instead of parents getting really involved and managing aspects of the daily life. What I will say is that while this study focuses specifically on second generation parenting techniques, we don't yet know if the third generation will ultimately meet these benchmarks for success. This is a pretty tall order among these young people. We know from studies among Asian Americans whose parents put really stringent expectations in terms of going to a very elite school, that this can cause some Asian Americans to feel like they are not connected to their ethnic or racial identity. It causes them to feel like if they don't meet those really high stringent benchmarks that their parents want, they feel alienated from the Asian American community and begin to distance themselves from it. So is it possible that for these third generation children, when they grow up, if they're not able to meet the standards that their parents have set for them, will they begin to feel alienated from their religious community or their ethnic community? This is all for future study, and I will say that the parents were really excited for me to conduct this research, and they felt very happy so far with the results, and they wanted me to come back and say 10 or 15 years and repeat the study. So we will see. But with that, I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Very much. Well, now we can open the floor for questions, and we'll take questions maybe here first, and then look to the Q&A.
Sure.
So why don't we begin over here?
It's a few serendipity that brought to me, and this is quite a pertinent topic for me. I was looking for another topic.
Oh.
I have lots of questions, but I will give the chance to the others. But
Okay.
I want one question for you. This shame honor culture that the Oriental world, including the world that I came from, East Africa, how does that impinge upon this topic of success? How does that shame and honor?
Okay.
I come from that culture.
And maybe Rebecca, you don't mind for the Zoom people.
Yeah.
Repeat a little bit the question.
Okay, so I'm going to try to interpret your question. We had a question here about shame and honor across sexes within this community. So
Success.
Success.
So, yeah. When you come from a shame and honor culture, like I come from that culture in Ethiopia, that defines our kids, to succeed.
Oh, I see.
In such a way that if they don't make it, they feel ashamed.
Okay.
They are placing a lot of burden on our
Okay.
kids.
Okay, so we have a question about sort of immigrant ideas of success and shame, and that there's something called an immigrant bargain, where parents come to the United States as immigrants, and oftentimes people held middle-class careers back where they're from, but when they come to the United States, it's like they have to start from the bottom and work really hard. And they sort of pass on this sort of, the parents sort of take the hit in order to make sure that their American-born children can be successful. And then those American-born children have a lot of burden on them to make sure that their parents who struggled so hard in the United States are going to succeed. Now, what's interesting is that my study focused on the grown-up second generation, the folks who were born from immigrant parents, now are grown up. They have sort of met the immigrant bargain. The parents in my study have all succeeded in the ways that I think their parents wanted them to. And now the question is for the third generation. Now we're talking about the grandparents were the immigrants. That sort of intense scrutiny, that sort of immigrant bargain is kind of further away from them. They don't feel that same exact pressure that the second generation did. And so these parents are actually really, I didn't get to talk about this a lot, so I'm really glad that you asked this question. The parents in this study are really responding to the ways that they were raised in immigrant households and how they raised their American children. And they're saying, you know what, there was a lot that went on in these immigrant households that I don't necessarily want to pass on to the next generation. We had a lot of pressure to become doctors, lawyers, engineers. That was it. Like my parents just said, you can only major in this one thing, and these are the expectations. For my kids, hey, you know what? If they want to go into a different type of line of work, let's say if they want to grow up to become a sociologist, that wasn't open to me, but that should be open to the third generation. That said, they need to do it with excellence. They can't just become a sociologist, but then never be employed. We still expect them to meet those socioeconomic benchmarks because, for goodness sake, we want them to be able to grow up and go to charity benefits themselves to raise money for like the global Muslim community and other people in their neighborhoods. But they're a little bit further away from that intensive immigrant bargain that I think that you're heading on. And I hope that I answered your question.
I have like a few questions, but like I'm gonna start looking a little bit simpler. Within like the Arab community, there are differences or disparities between, for instance, how Yemenis deal with like themselves, that they're a very close community compared to, for instance, more North African, like Moroccan or Egyptian like people. They're a lot more open to like integrating with like the greater society. Did you consider like how that can affect like the outcomes that people like experience, whether how much open they are to outside society compared to like maintaining like that close like ethnic circle that they usually do?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question for Zoom, and I'm going to do my best to interpret it. So basically, it's a question about the sort of internal diversity in terms of nationality within the Arab American community, or it doesn't have to necessarily fall along nationality lines, but this idea that some are more very close-knit with the community from the old country, let's say, that transnational network, whereas other members of the Arab American community might be more integration-minded. Now, I will say that by and large, the sort of disposition among the second generation is that their parents, the immigrants, were very much interested in maintaining particular ethnic ties, where the Lebanese would hang out with the Lebanese, the Indo-Pakistani families would hang out only with other Indo-Pakistani families. Whereas the second generation, having been raised in the United States, having gone to college themselves, participated in the college MSA at the University of Michigan or elsewhere, they actually they envision sort of a colorblind ummah, one where their children can be free to marry other Muslims from any ethnic or racial background. And they're really trying to challenge the sort of racial and ethnic divisions within the community. The folks in my study really saw that more as a generational difference as opposed to being associated with a particular ethnic group.
So in your study, I was wondering, like throughout the slides, Does the sex of a child affect the way that they are being raised or taught in order to grow and cultivate a more Americanized culture now?
I love this question. Thank you so much for hitting on it. So again, these parents, they're American born, and many of them are reflecting on their own childhood. Sorry, and I'm going to repeat the question for Zoom. I just realized it was a question about gender and if girls and boys, if there are different gendered expectations for their children. So there was definitely a heteronormative bias here. They want their kids to they want their girls and boys to grow up to marry the opposite sex and have children. Okay, so let's just get that off the bat. But I will say that for many of the parents in the study, especially the mothers, they remember being treated very differently from their brothers, and they did not want this for their girls. So for example, they wanted to make sure that both the boys and the girls would be able to grow up, have those college degrees and then some, and be able to stand on their own 2 feet no matter what happened. And there was a lot actually that went on, particularly among mothers and daughters, that worked really hard to erase or undo some of the gendered stigma. So for example, many of the women in my study were in the medical field, practicing physicians or something. And they talked about how when they were growing up, talking about menstruation was a big taboo, very shameful. And they're saying, I am a medical doctor. I know that menstruating is not shameful. This is a natural part of being a female, and so they're not afraid to talk to their daughters about these things. I had a long conversation with mothers and fathers, as well as the educators, about like the sex ed curriculum and making sure that the children were leaving like the Islamic school with an idea of what a healthy sex life should look like, you know, and which is very different from how other sort of expectations about the immigrant community would be. This is very much an American-born congregation. So I hope that answered your question.
Do you want to take a Zoom question?
Sure. So let me see if I can pull open Zoom. Hello, my Zoom people. Okay. Okay, Saula, it's hard to hear the questions. Anonymous, thank you for the presentation. I can't see this, okay. Difference in your results among the different groups, for instance, between Asian and Arab Americans. Okay, so what is sort of interesting about this is that I did not actually find too many differences between the South Asian community and the Arab American community. In many ways, they tried really hard to come together as one sort of single unified group. And actually, there was a lot more in common than difference. Really, the only difference that I found among these two groups is that there was sort of a reputation among the American-born Arab community that they would be a little bit more ostentatious with their wealth, as opposed to the South Asian community, who would maybe not spend as much money on a really expensive car or expensive home. But the interesting thing is that this was actually judged and regarded very positively in the community. And it's something that the Arab American families actually felt ashamed about. So like I was talking to a woman with an Hermes scarf and a name brand handbag, and she's like, I'm actually really embarrassed that I spent this money on these things, and I really wish I could be more like my South Asian brothers and sisters and not spend money on these things. So that was really the difference that I found there. I'm curious, is that you purposely sampled? Okay, well, I'll ask. So Hikmatu asked, did I purposely sample Asian and Arab Muslims? And the answer there is yes. So in the sort of suburban Metro Detroit community, there's a large number of Arab and South Asian Muslims, and to a lesser extent, a number of let's say, white European converts or Bosnian folks, or perhaps African-American Muslims. And of course, they do exist in the Metro Detroit suburbs. However, what I was trying to sort of single out here was the experience of being a second-generation Muslim American, which meant that to sort of get the numbers in the suburbs, that basically meant that they were South Asian and Arab American. As you know, with African Americans, they might have been Muslims for many more generations. There were also like people in the Arab American community whose families migrated, like when mine did in the early 1900s, but that is a very different experience than being second generation, raising the third generation. So I was trying to isolate these sort of generational differences. Yeah.
So, first of all, I think that this is a really interesting presentation. It's definitely a very unique angle that I haven't heard about before. So I really appreciate being able to listen to you. And then for my question, in Dr. Laura's book, I remember she talked about how between the concerted cultivation and natural growth, there were some pros and cons in between. And one of the things that stuck in my head was that in natural growth, there was a higher sense of community and familial obligations. And what I am wondering is that in integrating Muslim identity among within concerted cultivation, if that would have made up for that lack of community or familial obligations, or made up any other things that they could have learned from natural growth techniques.
Okay, so there was a question in the audience about the differences between the natural growth and the concerted cultivation techniques in Larove's original conception, and some of the pros and cons of each parenting style. And so with the natural growth parenting style, it was much more hands-off or laissez-faire, which meant that if a child was struggling, they would often kind of be left to struggle. However, because they had much more free time, oftentimes there would be a higher, like they would be able to bond with their families more, have more community engagement, and often have a lot more like free time to explore their own personal creativity. It also allowed them to be able to explore things, try and fail, whereas the concerted cultivation folks, they were much more hands-on, like sort of like a little germ in a petri dish or something, very manipulative, very precise. But your question was more specifically about how we ask it one more time? Yeah, how the weaving of Muslim identity within concerted cultivation could have made up for the shortcomings of familial and communal. Oh, okay, I love that. That's okay. So the question is, how did the Muslim identity sort of intervene in some of the patterns among concerted cultivation households that might isolate them from their larger community, whereas being rooted in Islam or the Muslim American community would, by dint of them being rooted in that community, give them that sense of community. And I think that that is actually a really beautiful point that I did not make in this paper, but you're right, that basically it's overriding some of those more negative aspects, or I shouldn't say negative, but some of the cons of the concerted cultivation framework. Because they're plugged into this Muslim community, what they're intentionally doing is raising their kids with a group of, like a core group of people that are going through the same sort of experiences with them. They have a cohort that they can rely on, which is very different from like the concerted cultivation where even within households, children in the same family might be competing for each, for parents' attention, or like competing to be the best one in the family. And I will say that among this community, that sort of competitive edge was not something they were trying to hone in their children. They wanted their kids to be successful, yes, but maybe not the competitive edge. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how Islamic were they interested in keeping their kids? Because even if you go to like an Islamic country, you'd find a very wide range of how strict or how practicing people are. Starting from not practicing at all to like really, really strict to like it's scary strict. Was there this much of like variance in the people you were studying, or did you feel that they were kind of like all the same?
Okay.
May I add to that question?
Okay.
And answer it. I have raised children here. We come from a Christian background. Our kids, they have this negotiated identity.
Uh-huh.
You know, at home, they are with us. You know, we do normal things to have our kids, you know, stay in the Christian place.
Mhm.
And then at the same time, you know, they go to the school, you know, that bigger space of the world. So my little space, I call it, you know, little Ethiopia, because I'm from Ethiopia.
Uh-huh.
We have ethnic language, ethnic food, and then our faith. And then when they go to the outside world, you know, they have their own peers, schools, football, and then have this the digital thing, which
Uh-huh.
is alien to most of us. So they live between these two worlds. And so in the third, that's where their identity is contested, in the third space.
Yes.
So how studies show that most kids, when they go to college, you know, 70%, according to what I've tried to study, you know, they just drift away from their faith. I don't know what happens. Is that the trend? So
Okay.
I'm speaking about, you know, how do immigrant kids, you know, at some level, negotiate their identity.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm connecting my question with the previous question.
Okay, so there was two questions. So the first is about sort of the level and intensity of religiosity as well as the expression of the religiosity. And so as I alluded to during the talk, it wasn't enough to just be Muslim in name only or a sort of cultural Muslim. No, we want our kids to do their best to pray 5 times a day. So some of the families attended the mosque services very regularly. Some attended less frequently or would go for social events, but not for prayer. But by and large, parents were trying really hard to teach their kids to pray 5 times a day, to meet the 5 pillars, you know, really live conscientiously Muslim lives. Now, sort of connecting that to the question to the gentleman behind you who was asking about sort of religion during the life course. So like what happens? You raise Muslim kids and any faith, you raise kids in a household, but then they grow up, they have to go to college, they have to leave the nest at some point. What happens then? What I'll say first and foremost is that when you study religion, we know that one's attachment to religion is not stable over the life course. People's attachment to their religion, it shifts and changes over how old they are. Most young people are going through a sort of stage in their development where they're starting to break away from their parents, which often means taking a step back from religion or trying to sort of refine or change. The question is, after college, what are they going to do then? When it's time for them to find a life partner, perhaps raise a family of their own, is that when they return to religion? How will it fit in then? Now, of course, I can't make predictions. However, it is this sort of the parents hope that when their kids are going to college and the parents already expect that their kids are going to be taking a step back from Islam or maybe just changing the way they're thinking about it, that they have the sort of rootedness or centeredness in their Islam that they can come back to it, that they can explore, they're free to explore, ask questions, maybe they even want to challenge some things, and that's okay. But ultimately they want the sort of more general idea of God and religiosity to stay with them. So I hope that answered the questions. Yes, Mohammed.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. So I guess my question is, you discussed how these Muslim American families, they chose to send their kids to an Islamic school. And I guess what I wonder is the reasoning for sending them to an Islamic school. And part of that relates to, first of all, the parents. I wonder how many of them went to an Islamic school growing up, what percentage? And the reason I ask is because I know some folks who did not go to an Islamic school, who, growing up, they felt like the other. And so by sending their children to an, and also they see other children of immigrants who left the faith maybe. So these are some of the motivations for sending to an Islamic school. And then I think about also the, in politics where Muslims maybe become a focal point, a target. And that's another reason why somebody might prefer an Islamic school. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud, and I wonder if you could comment on what you found.
Okay, so this was a question from Muhammad Khalil about sort of whether or not the parents in this study attended an Islamic school themselves, and if that had an influence on whether or not they wanted to send their children. Because oftentimes, especially for people of this cohort, they were coming of age pre 9/11. There was very little understanding about Islam or what it was. And yeah, there's questions about like, so what is it like to be the only brown kid in the public school who's trying to like keep halal? That's really hard and really alienating and isolating. So wouldn't it be easier to have their kids in the Islamic school? And yes, many parents definitely reflected on that feeling of isolation and alienation in the public schools that they grew up with. They felt like their parents, in a sort of natural growth kind of way, just kind of like threw them into the public school and said, okay, there you go, on your own, deal with this. And they couldn't turn to their immigrant parents to help them understand what to do because their parents didn't go to an American public school. And they certainly couldn't talk to their parents about the types of things they saw in the public school, whether it might be discussions about sex or alcohol, smoking. So they really did feel quite isolated from their parents. And so these parents are reflecting on that experience, trying to make sure that their kids not only don't feel isolated from their peers, but don't feel isolated from their own parents. And so a quirk about these Islamic schools that we're understudying here that I didn't get to cover yet, so I'm really glad you brought it up, is that they all ended at 8th grade. They were K through 8 Islamic schools. And actually, there's only one Islamic school in Metro Detroit that serves high school students. It's in the inner city, it's the Al-Khas Academy, and it's in Hamtramck. Now, these parents were really not interested in sending their kids to that school, but they were actually not only not interested in sending their kids to this particular school, they didn't want to establish a Muslim high school because they felt that at that point in their child's development, they're starting their adolescent years, this is when they should be able to stand on their own 2 feet in their faith. So they spent their primary school and middle school years in the Islamic school, learning about the basics of what it means to be a Muslim, sort of imbibing the identity, and they should have the confidence at that point to enter into the public school and be able to advocate for themselves and be okay to be different from everybody else. Whereas it's a little bit too much to ask a kindergartner or a first grader to be able to sort of cope with that isolation or alienation. So I really hope that it answered your question, and that really does explain some of their attraction to the school. Yes.
How do the kids feel about growing up with this kind of sense that, okay, you're in a country more or less that you are required not to follow what the mainstream attribute of like a normal average member of society is? How do they feel? Like, do they feel that this is a responsibility I have to do because if I become what is considered like as an average American, that means that I'm losing part of something that is very important, which is my faith? Or do they not care about this, or do they understand like the importance of this, or do they like does it affect them negatively that they like feel that, okay, I essentially have to grow up to be alien from the society that I'm growing up?
Okay, and so, this question is about the kids, and by the kids, do you mean the 3rd generation or the 2nd generation?
I mean, okay, both, I guess.
Okay.
It's important to know, like.
Okay, so the question was if the kids sort of come to, I'm going to interpret your question, come to resent the fact that they're minoritized? Is that kind of what you're asking? Or like it's all this big burden?
It doesn't, like, if they don't resent it, fine. Like, I'm just asking, like, how do they feel for someone growing up in a society where they feel like, hey, I have to be different from this society?
Okay, so the question is what is it like to have to grow up and be different? Can you be outside the mainstream in order to maintain what your parents want to be an essential part of your identity, the Muslim identity?
Right.
So I'll start just by saying that the children, the 3rd generation kids, they're young. I didn't have IRB protocol to really talk to the kids and interview them, so I don't know how they felt about it. But I can say that like the 2nd generation's reflections on it, it's like when they were kids, they remember getting bullied at school, being called names, and they found it really frustrating, the lack of knowledge about Muslims, and that they just didn't have the language to be like, hey, I thought this was the United States of America. We're supposed to be able to pray how we want. Like, this is supposed to be okay. So now as adults, they are, like I said, They're pretty affluent. They hold very professional white collar careers. And so now they're in a position where they can be members of the public school board, which they are, hold positions on like the diversity committee in the Bloomfield Hills public schools, and be able to say, no, we're going to make accommodations for Muslim Americans. We're going to make sure that, that children have, like, that if they want, they can step away to pray, or that they can have food accommodations made for them. And so the parents are using what they've learned in their sort of adult life, or maybe their college years, about how to make space for themselves at the multicultural table. And they're making sure that their kids are equipped to be able to deal with that, so they're not facing the exact same context that they did when they were growing up. Yes.
This reminds me simply of something like happens all over. For example, I am Muslim, of course. We grew up in a society where Christmas is such a big deal. Like, you see decorations everywhere, you see people singing or doing a whole bunch, which is great, right? But we also grow up where it's like we can't really celebrate Christmas, but we're going to schools, we're surrounded by our peers who do. And I feel like that's kind of what you were hitting at, where do we lose kind of who we are because our faith says that we can't really practice such things, but we're surrounded by it. So I feel like, in a way, we address what's happening around us to a certain extent, recognizing that each holiday or like each activity that is happening that is outside of our faith is still able to be respected and understood. But at the same time, it doesn't devalue us or make us more alienated just because we're not part of it. Because it reminds us that we have our own holidays and our own practices that we do that other people might not understand. And yes, it's a little weird just because everybody's doing it and nobody really practices or celebrates our holidays the way that they celebrate like the Christian holiday. But that's more of like an uprising, generational, community like advantage or disadvantage, if that makes sense.
It does. Like, I was just like curious about whether or not the kids had any like disconnects from what their kind of like expectation is ethnically from versus societally.
Okay, so there's sort of like a conversation going on in the audience, and I really wish that the people on Zoom could hear it because it's so good. Because there's a question about like, well, when you're a Muslim American, you're growing up, and like, so, okay, great example. It's October, which for a lot of families means Halloween, trick-or-treating. And I love talking about Halloween with this study because the parents in my study were like split down the middle about what to do about Halloween. Because is this devil worship? Is this haram? No, the kids are just dressing up like superheroes. What's wrong with that? They're getting candy. Well, why should the kids be going door to door begging for candy anyway? Like, talking about Halloween was like, I wrote a whole chapter about these sort of like issues because it's just a lot of fun and it helps sort of illuminate, I think, some of these questions, because a lot of kids who grew up in immigrant households were told that Halloween is haram. What are we talking about? That is devil worship. End of discussion. And they're going to public school, like, you know, trading candy with their friends, and they felt like they had to hide it from their parents. And then they're growing up going, what did I hide from them? I don't feel like that was devil worship. Now, so for some parents in the study, they do still forbid Halloween, but they have a much more sort of open-minded sort of understanding of what Halloween is, that people go trick-or-treating, but that doesn't mean that their neighbors are all devil worshipers. Whereas some families do get involved in it, other parents are trying to like make these accommodations for their kids where like, okay, we're not going to go trick-or-treating, but I'll take you to Chuck E. Cheese and we'll load up on candy. Or like another household, they set up pretend houses in the basement out of cardboard boxes, and the kids went around in the basement trick-or-treating. Or like some say you can hand out candy, but you can't go asking for candy. So what I'm saying is like, there's a lot here that sort of hints at their sort of ways that they're trying to make room for their Muslim identity, even in places where their immigrant parents told them Islam does not belong. There's no such thing as, you know, halal trick-or-treating. And they're trying to say, maybe there is some room we can carve out here. Okay, Mohammed's getting up, so I think it might mean it's about time to wrap up.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Rebecca Karam. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'll just say here to the folks on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Karam, for a very interesting presentation. And actually, this discussion of Halloween is a serious discussion, as I know these days coming up. But anyway, thank you so much. And Dr. Karam, this is Dr. Karam's second year here at Michigan State. And we hope to benefit from Dr. Karam's research. So thank you so much again. And just so you all know, Muslim Studies, we have a webinar next week from today and on Islam and markets. It's with the Business College. And then we have a webinar the following Thursday on Muslims and medicine with several faculty, including Dr. Farha Abbasi, who's with us, and maybe there are others who are with us. So you don't want to miss that. And so please check out our website for additional events. Thank you, Dr. Karam, again, and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you.